Hello and welcome to the HOA Show, where we discuss the news, problems, trends, and critical issues relating to life in a homeowner association. Join us every episode, and together we'll explore how to survive and thrive in the dizzying world of HOAs.
Hello, and welcome to the HOA Show. I'm your host, Ryan Gazelle, and in this episode, we'll be discussing the Corporate Transparency Act. I'm joined today by Jeff Beaumont and Natalie Stewart. Jeff Beaumont is a named partner in the Beaumont Taschen law firm specializing in common interest developments. And Natalie Stewart is the owner of CTA Review, a third-party service dedicated to facilitating the beneficial ownership information reporting procedure. Thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Yes, Ryan, thanks for inviting us both back. I think we've both been guests on your...
You have, both of you have. So Natalie, what is the Corporate Transparency Act, or the CTA? Can you take us through the basics?
I sure can. The Corporate Transparency Act is a federal law that is aimed at stopping illegal activities like tax fraud, money laundering, and funding for terrorism. The genesis, it's basically intended to provide law enforcement with what they're calling beneficial ownership information. And they feel like having a database with all of these small entities and beneficial owners, those having substantial control of them, will be able to help them identify misconduct that is happening through small businesses. According to Congress, using shell corporations and anonymously owned businesses is a widely used tactic that actually affects national security and economic integrity. And so essentially, the Corporate Transparency Act creates a new regulation that requires small business entities to report the name of their entity and who controls them. The story that I've heard was post 9/11, there was an airport and there was land surrounding this airport and nobody could find out who owned this property. It was owned in a trust that was in another trust that was in another trust. And it took lots of energy, government money to try and find out who owned this actual property surrounding this airport, because we had this new national security concern. And so from there, it trickled into this need to get this information. And how are we going to get this information? The Corporate Transparency Act, which was in fact a small little tiny bit of a larger national security bill that was passed back in 2021. Since 2021, the government has been coming up with a plan on how to enact this bill and how to collect this information, which was developed in early this year, launched January 1st, 2024. And now all of the companies that are wrapped up into this must report by January 1st, 2025.
And that led then to the seedy world of community associations?
Yes. Actually, it did. For a while, and I'm sure you and Jeff, or I know Jeff was probably aware of this, like most attorneys in this industry. And people had differing opinions of whether they or not they thought HOAs were going to have to comply. Jeff, do you remember that period of time?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, everybody was reading it because you read it by the letter of the law, you say, wow, this incorporates HOAs, because the definition of a reporting company is an entity that is created or registered in the US by filing a document with the Secretary of State or similar office. In different states, I'm assuming your listeners are primarily California, but if not, in different states, you'll have a Bureau of Conveyances or a similar entity like the Secretary of State where you register documents. And so you read that and you go, wow, okay, HOAs register with the Secretary of State when they are founded, but we are not business entities. We don't have beneficial owners. This can't apply to us. And so CAI, which I'm sure we're all very aware of, the Community Associations Institute, actually went and asked the Department of Treasury. And they said, does this apply to us? And they came back with a resounding yes. And we expect you to comply. And that was earlier this year.
Okay, so what does compliance look like?
Well, compliance looks like filing what's called a beneficial owner report.
Okay.
So I'm going to back it up just a little bit and introduce some new terms that we are going to be using during this podcast.
We might need a glossary attached to the podcast.
This is a new dictionary. So first off, HOAs are going to have to report what is called a beneficial ownership information report. You will hear that as the BOIR. Board members are now considered beneficial owners. Those are called BOs. And we are reporting to FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network. So HOAs are reporting companies. They must file beneficial owner reports, and these reports must go to FinCEN. And one of the big issues we have with this is that board members, I get calls every day and they say, we are not beneficial owners. I'm a volunteer leader. I don't get paid. There's no actually perceived benefit to me. I'm very confused.
I would say most board members would say there's zero benefit to serving on their board of directors.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't feel like they've earned the title of beneficial owner. But so these reporting companies, HOAs, have to file a report, beneficial owners. Beneficial owners are board members. Now, identifying the beneficial owners, that has had a lot of conversation around that as well, because beneficial owners, the Corporate Transparency Act doesn't actually identify board members. So you have to back into it in their definition of beneficial owner. So a beneficial owner of a reporting company is an individual who directly or indirectly exercises substantial control over a reporting company. So these are the people who exercise substantial control over the homeowners association, which is basically identified as the board members because they are the important decision makers. But since we've got Jeff on this recording, I want to ask Jeff a couple questions about beneficial owners that I get every day. Do you think, Jeff, that of an association, you've got, let's say, 5 board members, that only the president needs to report?
Absolutely not. I like to go back to your point, Natalie, because you define what a beneficial owner is, and you use the word substantial control. And some boards have come to me asking questions similar as to whether or not just the president needs to report, since the president is the substantial controller of the organization, which isn't the case. The president is just elected as an officer to chair meetings, right, and to be a liaison. But the ultimate decision-making for an organization, including common interest developments, comes from the board and the board majority. So that body is who exercises substantial control over any organization, including common interest development. So it would be each board member, each volunteer director would have to report under the CTA.
So just those elected board members, right?
Correct.
Not volunteers.
Exactly. Not architectural control committee members, not finance committee members. And, there's even a discussion about whether management falls within this category. And I think there's some good arguments on both sides as to whether management would, but at the end of the day, my strong position on that is no, management would not, even though they're in a position that could be perceived as exercising substantial control over a community and their assets. They're doing it at the direction of the board. It's the board that has the substantial control, the board that is making the decisions. And management's merely just carrying out those decisions as the managing agent. So my firm's position is that management does not fall within that category and does not have to report.
Yeah, that's similar to what I've heard from every other HOA attorney in this industry, because if you start looking at management, then you've got to look at their other advisors, their attorneys. Potentially they are advising their associations, but the board they're the people that are making those decisions. So there's a lot of different people that advise a board of directors. So once we have identified the actual beneficial owners of these reporting companies, you have to look at what they're asking for in the report. So it's not as scary as some people feel like it might be. The information, we'll start with the reporting company, which is the association. The information they're asking for is the legal name of the corporation. And this is going to be the name that you find in the articles of incorporation, not what you use in the office or what might be on the monument sign. This is the actual legal name of the corporation.
It's what's filed already with the Secretary of State.
Correct. Yeah, you have to go back to that original paperwork. And sometimes you'll find that within an association, you've got a legal name of the corporation and then a legal name of the association, which is even trickier. And they want the corporation name and then an address within the community. And I've heard a lot of different opinions on this. The CTA calls for an address of where the business is taking place. And the way it's interpreted with HOAs is they want an address of the association. So where is this business located? And you don't have to use a residential address. You can use a utility address. You can use a clubhouse, something that can actually get a federal agent to the property. It doesn't mean that they're going to mail you a letter.
It's the same thing we use in the insurance world. They want to be able to find it on a map where they can say, there it is, right?
I didn't know that, but that could be helpful to advise people that they can use the same address that they use for insurance. And that might give them a starting point, because a lot of people have a lot of trouble deciding which address they're actually going to use, because surprisingly, nobody wants to be associated with this. So if they've got...
Well, and that creates problems in the insurance world as well. When, a board member says, well, that's my address. Why is that on the application? Well, they just need to find it on a map. The underwriter's got to be able to find it. I think that's the same intention here.
Definitely. And then the last piece of information that FinCEN needs is the tax ID number. And so with that information, that is what the reporting company, the association, needs to report. In addition to that, we need the beneficial owner's information. And this is actually pretty simple. Full legal name, your residential address, your birth date, and a copy of your legal identification, driver's license, or passport are the first two options, is a U.S. government issued ID. If you are let's say a citizen of another country, you can also use your foreign passport if you have neither of the above options. And there's no, I'm going to repeat it loud and clear, no requirement for a social security number. That was released somewhere and really messed things up for a while, but that is not a requirement.
I'd like to jump in real quick to emphasize that, because that's definitely misinformation that's been exchanged for quite some time, and it's come back to me. And just to make sure everybody's clear, the reporting requirements does not include the social security number or any other identifying information other than a government issued ID. Some people are coming back asking if they have to provide their passport, and if they don't have a passport, do they have to go get one? It's amazing how misunderstood the reporting requirements are. But I think we should all take away with this is that social security numbers are not required, neither is blood type. And that was a joke, by the
way. No, but you do have to give your firstborn child. The third penalty is firstborn child if you willful noncompliance. So.
Okay. So it's just your name, your address, and a copy of your ID.
Birthday. It's essentially your driver's license, the information that's on your driver's license.
Which the government already has already.
Yes, in a different database that is not widely available and is not attached to a reporting company. When I think people are confused a lot on this is they're not asking actually the person to report, they're asking the entity to report. So the entity, the association is the one making the report and identifying who is in control of the association. So that's why there's a little bit of confusion on, they already have my driver's license. Sure, but they don't know that you're controlling that association. That's where the connection is missing from. The association's already listed at the Secretary of State. Great, but we don't necessarily know that you are in control of it. California has a reporting requirement, but not all states do. And so this is a federal law. All the entities have to report.
Got it.
And going forward, why is this such a big deal? The biggest issue with this is the ongoing requirement to update and comply every 30 days that there's a change in your beneficial owner information. In HOAs, the company information is never going to change. Tax ID is never going to change. You might change the legal name, but that's very rare. And the addresses are never going to change. The associations never move their location of business. So the entity is going to always remain the same, that information. But our board members, they change all the time. Every time there's a board member change, you have to update the report within 30 days.
And you have to pay again?
Okay, so we'll go into that in the future. If you want to file yourself, with FinCEN, you can file directly and there's no fee. So in theory, you could do this with no cost. Totally fine. That's an acceptable way of doing this. If you used a service like ours, we have an annual fee, but we don't need to discuss that at this moment. The updating, it's just tremendous. That's the part that gets me. It's not an annual. Like, why do they need to know within 30 days if a board member changes?
Natalie, real quick to also kind of piggyback on timing. So whenever board members change, which happens frequently, that change has to be reported within 30 days. Also, one thing that I want to make sure we're clear on, and I think we skipped over this, or maybe you're going to address it in the future, but entities formed, HOAs formed January 1st, 2024 on, have to report within 90 days of the corporation's formation. So even though we're looking at a January 1st, 2025 compliance deadline, if it's a new community, that reporting has to take place within 90 days of the formation of that new community. And then going back to the reporting information, the information that's required of board members, we talked about names, addresses, date of birth, and a government issued ID. Questions I have gotten is, well, who has access to this information? And Natalie, maybe you can expand on this, but I know for sure that it's very clear under the Department of Treasury's website that this is not public information, but it is information that's available in a database to non-government agencies like financial institutions. So it is information that's available to other agencies that the government allows access to, not the public at large, but definitely, for example, banks, lending institutions do have access to this information.
Do you see any potential negative implications from that?
I do. I've already seen firsthand and heard from board members that will not report. And if they're forced, they're not going to serve on their board. I don't think it's going to have a significant impact, but I do think it will have an impact on the pool of volunteers and communities.
Do you think that any of that concern is justified?
I think it...
Not to be insensitive, no, just, I'm wondering, what are the real potential drawbacks? Let's say that who could gain access to my information if I had it on there, and how could it negatively impact me?
Here's the issue. Data breaches are real. The importance of protecting our identity is significant in today's day and age. And the more databases your information exists in, the more exposure you have as an individual to identity theft, right?
Fair enough.
So it's definitely something that as a volunteer, you need to be aware of, that you're not only volunteering your time to help run your community, but you're also now having to report information that's going to be in a database that could be subject to a data breach, just like any other database your information is in.
You're just making yourself a bigger target.
Right. From a practical standpoint, your information, more likely than not, is already in enough databases where the exposure is probably going to be pretty minimal. But if you have, the protections that are available out there to monitor your identity and access to it and allow you to be a responsible, proactive individual and citizen with respect to knowing where your information is and being able to, in a real-time basis, monitor it, I honestly think that the exposure is very, very minimal.
So, Jeff, I've read recently that CAI is trying to combat this. How are they doing that? What are they doing?
Yeah, so like Natalie said, there's interested parties here. Congress, the Department of Treasury, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, all of those stakeholders, all those interested parties CAI has been engaging with for quite some time. And unfortunately, CAI has not gotten the response that they expect, nor should they expect. And there's been a lot of meetings, a lot of negotiations, and a lot of educating of the Department of Treasury, different Congress people, and we just have not gotten any movement as far as the Department of Treasury or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, both of which have authority under this statute to add to the list of exempted organizations. There's already a list of exempted organizations under the Corporate Transparency Act. All CAI is asking is add homeowners associations to that list. And they haven't done that yet. So because of that, CAI filed a lawsuit against the Department of Treasury back in, I think it was in September last month. And with that lawsuit, also filed an injunction to try to get a court order ordering the Department of Treasury not to enforce this as to associations, pending the outcome of the lawsuit. Now, that's not the only avenue CAI is approaching as well, because there's a legislative session left in the year called like a lame duck legislative session. That's from November 12th to December 20th. And we're trying to get this issue back before the legislature in Congress during that lame duck legislative session to try to get this attacked from a congressional standpoint as well. So CEI is attacking it from two angles, and we're hopeful that we can get some movement there. And that's why, frankly, some boards are being proactive and they're getting ahead of this and they're reaching out to Natalie or reporting on their own. Some are just taking a wait and see approach to see what happens with CEI's efforts here.
If you had to put a percentage on it, what do you think the odds are that we'll be able to get community associations exempt before the deadline of January 1st?
If you were to end it by just saying what's your prediction as far as odds in general, I would say I think we have a good chance of getting associations included in the list of exemptions. Before January 1st, I'm a little pessimistic about that. I really am, because just the way things move in the courts as well as in Congress, I question whether that can happen by January 1st. But from a big picture standpoint, I'm hopeful that we can accomplish this.
I would agree with you. The January 1st obstacle is pretty tough to overcome. And that leads us, I think, to the next natural question, which is January 1st comes and goes. You've got communities that have not complied. What are the penalties? What does that look like? Who's enforcing them?
I'll jump in on what the penalties actually are. And they're listed for willful noncompliance. Also, mind you, this isn't a fine that you get starting January 1st. This is for entities that have willfully not complied. The civil penalty is $591 per day. And there are criminal penalties associated with $10,000 and up to 2 years in prison. And Jeff, who would bear responsibility if these penalties were to be administered?
That's a great question. And at the end of the day, it really depends on the facts. And there's two, I think, common scenarios that a community may see and be confronted with. First is if there are board members that know about the Corporate Transparency Act, know about the mandatory reporting requirements, and knowingly refuse to comply, they're engaging in an intentional act to violate the law. If there's a penalty that comes from that, that intentional act is not something that the association or their insurance company will cover. Typically, an association has a duty to indemnify their volunteer board members or committee members from claims arising out of them performing their official duties, right? But if those actions that resulted in those claims were from intentional acts that violated the law, those are not things that a corporation can cover, nor their insurance company.
Correct.
So in those scenarios, it's clear that individual director would have to pay those penalties on their own.
I just to reiterate, I'm not aware of any directors and officers, insurance companies that would come in and defend these folks that are willfully breaking the law.
What do you do, Jeff, if you're the manager of an association and you've advised that they need to comply and they don't, or you have one board member who refuses to comply? What's the next step?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because that's going to come up. The other scenario, which is similar, is a board not knowing about the reporting requirements and just innocently violating it because they weren't aware of it. Management didn't tell them about it, prior board. That creates a different scenario and a different problem that the corporation may be able to step in and pay that penalty and then go forward with compliance. But to your point, Natalie, if a board member refuses, or a management company or manager comes to the board and educates them on these reporting requirements, and the board turns and says, thanks, but no thanks, management's in a very difficult situation where they would definitely need to document that in writing to make sure that management's on record giving clear advice and guidance on the mandatory reporting requirements. And then going forward, if something happens and there's penalties, management company's done their job. There's only so much the management company can do with respect to fulfilling their obligations under a management agreement, right? They just take direction as a managing agent for the board. But let's assume, Ryan on his board is doing a great job, but when it comes to reporting, he's just like anti-government, right? Doesn't want anybody to have anything associated with him, including his name. That's why he goes by Ryan.
I go by Big John.
Big John, right? I was trying to remember what name you go by. It changes all the time.
Tiny Tim today.
So in that case, the board's faced with having a fellow board member that's violating the law. And I think there would have to be some type of action taken to distance that board and that community from that board member. And it would have to be done through legal counsel. And as you know, board members can't just remove a fellow board member. So there'd have to be very, very careful, thoughtful actions taken. The homeowners can remove a board member. And if you go before the homeowners and try to get a recall of a board member that's refusing to comply with the law, that's a tough sell, because then people are going to look at you and say, what is the Corporate Transparency Act? It's going to create total chaos in that community. So I do think a board should, at a minimum, counsel that board member, meet with them in executive session, give them the consequences of not reporting, and decide whether or not they just want to go forward. And if there's penalties, hold that individual responsible. Hopefully, when they see the big picture and see the financial consequences that their actions could result in the association, and to Ryan's point, the insurance company not stepping in to protect them, they'll either comply or they'll resign.
The thought that occurred to me was, we all have these communities where there's that one person that lives there that files lawsuit after lawsuit. Do you see a way that one of those kind of owners, a repeat offender, if you will, could figure out or find out by going online if one of the board members has not, or if none of the board members have filed?
They won't be able to find it online. It's like Jeff said earlier, the database is completely sealed and not private. If you file, you can't get another copy. You can't search it. You can't access it. So there would be no way for somebody to go online and figure that out. I'm assuming that, and this is another thing in California, like, could you make a records request and ask to see a copy of the BOI report?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the Civil Code, Section 5200, there's a list of association records that members are entitled to, and that would not fall within the list of records
yet.
Well, if you actually have seen a BOI report, it has all of the PII on it, which is problematic, because if that beneficial owner report is in the management company's hands and then they're transferring it to a new management company, if a homeowner really does make a fuss and demands to see proof that it was filed, I'm one of those people that just says, like, if we can provide proof, let's do it, so that can go away instead of just reigniting that fire. So what we've done is created a certificate of compliance, which is a redacted copy of the beneficial owner report, so that if a homeowner says, we want proof, then the board or the association can provide proof without providing any private identifiable information.
Another question, FinCEN doesn't know how many board members you've got, right? So if you had a board of 5 members and only 3 filed, is there any way for them to know that not everybody has filed?
No, there's no question on the beneficial owner report of how many beneficial owners do you have and how many are filing. They would literally have to go to your governing documents and read them and figure out that your report was incomplete. And they can't even compare it really to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's database, while it's public and you can search it, it's not in a format that can be easily redacted and put into any sort of searchable fields. Potentially, they could subpoena the Secretary of State's office information. That is going so deep in the weeds on something like that I can't imagine that would happen. We're filing what we call a substantially complete report at direction of the board. I really don't do that yet. I don't want to do that yet because the deadline isn't until January 1st. So there's no reason to file a report that's not complete to kind of expose them for that much longer. But I have a feeling at the end of the year, we will be filing many, many substantially complete reports. Because Jeff, in your opinion, is it better to file a report with 3 out of 5 board members or not to file at all?
3 out of 5, 100% in my opinion, because that's, number one, upholding the spirit of the law. Department of Treasury wants these organizations to report, right? So having a report on file, I think, is upholding the spirit of the law. And to your point, not that we're trying to circumvent the law or violate it, but I think the chances of the government digging deep and finding out that you've only reported 3 out of 5 are slim to none. The last I checked, our government isn't just swimming in resources and figuring out where to put them. They're trying to figure out, how to put the next fire out. So I just I would much rather see a client report something rather than nothing.
So this sounds a little reassuring for some of those folks that are maybe concerned until you remember the penalties and the potential jail time, which
I don't think we even covered this really. There's no published FinCEN document of how and when penalties will be administered. I know they're not going to be broad. They're not going to just send them to they don't have our information. They don't have your information. They're looking for your information. So it's not going to be a broad sweeping penalty that to every entity that has not complied. But it gives them teeth to penalize you if they do find out about you. And what I have heard is that potentially the way they can do this is, that list of entities that has access or potential access to your information, the IRS. The IRS has your tax returns, they have your tax ID numbers, and they can compare that easily to beneficial owner reports that have filed and those that have not filed. So that's where they're saying that the government already has easy access to identify those entities who have not yet reported.
So let's say, we go forward and it's January 1st, my board files, and then we've got an election 6 months later. Do we have to start from scratch? Can we add the new board members that were added?
If you file directly with FinCEN, there's two ways. You can do an electronic upload, which then disappears, and every time you start from scratch. The second option is a PDF. The PDF you can save, but it requires somebody to save all of that information locally on their machine. And that's what a lot of board members and management companies don't want to do. If you use a third-party service provider like CTA Review, we have mechanisms. We archive everything. We save everything. It's a really easy update. There's other filing platforms out there that offer the same thing.
To your point, Natalie, the concern with maintaining those records is if a hacker gets in and then steals those personal records, that could create liability for the association.
Yeah, and you're not even talking about just hackers. Management, there's transitions. There's many people in, management software. It's wonderful, and it has probably audit trails and a lot of security in there, but you've got a lot of people with access to that information. And like Jeff said, like the bigger your exposure, the bigger your potential for some sort of identity hack might be. And so when let's say you transfer to a new management company where you don't know what their protocols are, and your beneficial owner and your ID is in a nice little file that gets emailed to that company. And then 4 years down the line, it goes to another company. You want kind of reassurance that, let's say this does go away, that the company you use that is saving your information has a mechanism to destroy it, and that it doesn't just get lost in that software forever to be continually sent to another entity.
That makes sense. Jeff, have you had clients try to comply with this new law already?
Yes, I have. New developments I've been working with. We're not filing, but definitely helping guide them as far as whether they are obligated to file, what resources are available to them. But new communities have been filing this year. Going back to you had a comment, Ryan, or Tiny Tim, I'm sorry. And you mentioned, what happens if a board changes within 6 months and there's an election. One thing I want to make sure we put in the parking lot for us either to discuss or for communities and boards and management to consider is, how do we deal with this on a going forward basis, and what are some best practices we can put together to set all of us up for success, including homeowners. And one thing that comes to mind is, as a volunteer board member, you throw your name in the hat, you just want to help out in your community. You really need to know what you're up against. And there's so much to that position that you're taking on that really should be enjoyable. But you also want to make sure that homeowners have realistic expectations. And if they have some personal feelings about providing their information to the government, they should know beforehand, before that name is thrown in the hat. So in the election materials, I'm suggesting to communities and inspectors of election, which I've spoke with a few already, that thought this is a good idea, is to make sure that there's language in there that says if you're elected, this is something that you will have to comply with under the law.
Setting expectations.
Exactly.
That's a really great point, Jeff, and probably something everybody should do. What are some other best practices moving forward?
I like Natalie's point about confidential information. Natalie, I don't know if you have any others that you can add to that, but that was a great point, suggestion.
I think the biggest thing that an association can do is the board gets has a meeting, they decide how they're going to comply, what they're going to do, and what their update process is going to be. So when they get to that board meeting, when they have new board members that they've told we've got to comply, they know what they're going to do and how they're going to update. And so if that's filing on your own, if it's using your management company, your attorney, a third party, just having a plan moving forward so there's no surprises and that you are able to then comply within that 30 days. And while Jeff said that new developments have 90 days this year, starting January 1st, they only have 30 days. So that means essentially they go to report to they form the association and they immediately need to be filing. And those reports have to be updated consistently. The new developments have new changes all the time. It goes to the board. There's developer members sitting on the board. Those people transition out as escrows go in. They've got new board members coming on. You've got new phases being annexed onto an association. We didn't really touch on the other people that have substantial control that are considered beneficial owners. And those are people who own 25% or more of the entity. Meaning if there's an association that has a developer that still owns 25% of the units, that developer has substantial control and they need to also report. If they are small associations, 4-unit associations, everybody has to report. So that's a big factor in this reporting process as well.
If you own more than 25%.
25%.
Wow, that is interesting.
And I'm seeing that really often in commercial properties, more than HOAs. So residential, 25% is a lot.
That's an interesting concept that I didn't think about, but there's a strong argument that, and I see that perspective. If a developer or single owner owns more than 25% of the homes in a community, they could be deemed required to report. Someone that has substantial ownership.
Or an investment company.
But on the flip side, who's the target of this law? It's the organization, right? It's not its members. Its members just own property, but the organization is the corporation that either owns and or maintains property within this organization. One of the qualifying criteria to determine whether or not that organization has to report is, what type of assets does it have? And if I happen to own 25 homes in a 100-unit community, that's not the corporation's asset. That's my own asset, right? The corporation's asset is the assessment income, and you don't count the common area property, but it's really the assessment income that's the issue, not what somebody may own in the community. So that's an interesting topic. First time I really thought that through.
Jeff, on that, what you just said, 25%, that owner in an association will also have 25% of the votes on, voting for board members, special assessments, things of that nature. So that's where they are putting that substantial control on that owner.
Yeah, and I would argue against that premise because owners do have the right to vote. And if I have 25 homes out of 100, I do have a pretty big vote, but only on very limited issues. Amending the documents.
You don't have quorum.
Electing the board. Let's say I own 51% of the homes. I still can't vote and make decisions on entering in the contracts or important business decisions for the I can't steer the organization from a board of directors standpoint. It's a slippery slope, but I think, at the end of the day, it's the board that should be the focus. I don't know about the homeowners and whether or not they own a certain percentage of homes. But again, it's the first time I really thought this through, and it's an interesting concept.
It sure is.
You wouldn't be, if 25% of the homes, you still wouldn't be able to maybe vote on which terrorist organization to fund.
Exactly.
Be the board, right? Yeah.
Judy down the street, that's who we're supporting. Well, thank you guys both so much for being on the show. It sounds like, in summary, CAI is trying to fight this. They're trying to help you listeners, but in the interim, until that change is made and we are exempt as community associations, you do have to comply come January 1st. Reach out to your attorney for guidance, and folks like Natalie and her company, make sure that your community is in compliance come January 1st. Anything else either of you would like to add?
I just want to finish off with, if you don't want this to happen, go to CAI online and click through to their Corporate Transparency Act page, and you can get more information on how to support HR 9045, which is the Community Association Reporting Exemption Act. And that's how this could possibly be solved legislatively. Right now, we can support the litigation, in spirit, but there's nothing we can really do. But you can talk to your congresspeople and see if, they can potentially support that act.
And we'll put a link to that webpage on our website as well underneath the podcast. Thank you guys both so much for joining us today. If any of our listeners want to learn more or contact you, how would they do so, Jeff?
Absolutely. Yeah, my email is jbeaumont, BEAUMONT @HOAattorneys.com.
And Natalie?
My website, easiest place to find me is ctareview.com. And you can send me an email at Natalie, NATALIE, @ctareview.com.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Natalie Stewart and Jeff Beaumont. As we end our episode, we'd like to remind our listeners, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for topics you'd like to learn more about, you can email us at feedback@hoashow.org. Join us next time on the HOA Show.
To share or subscribe to the HOA Show, visit us at hoashow.org. There, you'll be able to listen to other episodes, find helpful resources relating to HOAs, provide feedback, submit questions, and check out other great stuff. The HOA Show podcast has been made possible by the contributions of Klein Agency Insurance Brokers, leaders in the community association industry. The views and opinions expressed by the podcast, its presenters and guests, do not constitute legal advice. For more information on how the topics in discussion apply to you, please consult with your own legal counsel.